So today we're going to talk about FC Dallas in the moving forward series, and there's no doubt that this was one of the worst seasons for FC Dallas in their franchise history, and for a team that have regularly made it the playoffs. This was kind of uncharted territory of how bad they were throughout the season. Though I will say that, they kind of got off to a really rough start to the season, and they kind of tried to dig themselves out of it with a relatively good run in the middle of the season, but ultimately they weren't able to be consistent enough in the second half of the season to get themselves back into the playoffs. But overall, this season they finished with a 7-2-15 record, and they finished with 33 points. And actually, it's not a 7-2-15 record. It's actually a 7-12-15 record that they had, because if you add that number, they only played like 24 games. But yeah, it's a 7-12-15 record that they had, and they only finished with 33 points. They scored 47 goals this season, but gave up 56 goals this season, which was tied with Austin with the worst defensive record in the league, and their goal differential is -9, and they finished 11 in the Western Conference. Top goal scorer for this team, unsurprisingly, Ricardo Pepi with 13 goals this season, followed by Obrian with 9 goals. Then you got Jesus Ferreira with 8 goals, Frank O'Hara with 7 goals, and Ryan Hollinshead to round out the top 5 with 3 goals. Top assist leader, you got Jesus Ferreira with 9 assists, followed by Shun with 6 assists. Then you got Hollinshead with 5 assists, Obrian with 4 assists, and Jesus Ferreira rounds up the top 5 with 3 assists for FC Dallas. So, what went right for Dallas this season? Well, I mean, it's pretty obvious that if there is one bright side that Dallas has after a rough season that they had this year, is the sensation of Ricardo Pepi. I mean, what an incredible year Ricardo Pepi has, and rightfully so, winning the Young Player of the Year. I mean, this is a guy that not only finishes the top goal scorer of the team, but this was also a guy that scored the winning penalty in that MLS All-Star game, and also in his first 2 appearance with the U.S. men's national team, or actually in his first ever appearance for the U.S. men's national team. He bagged himself a brace. I mean, you just could not write a better script of an incredible year that Ricardo Pepi has, and there's no doubt that this offseason he is definitely going to be making that big money move. I mean, he's already kind of asked FC Dallas that, yeah, most likely I'm not going to return to your team. I'm ready to make the jump to Europe, and there's already a ton of offer that Dallas is receiving from teams in Europe to get the service of Ricardo Pepi, and he's definitely a guy that I think if he continue the growth rate that he is right now in the projectile, that he could be a future U.S. men's national team number 9, and maybe finally the U.S. can finally find the striker that they've been looking for a while now, because when you look at the U.S. men's national team, they really haven't had a lethal goal scored in terms of that number 9 position since Clint Dempsey, of course, retired from the national team. And then, of course, the other thing that went right for them, at least for their fans' sake, is the fact that they won their first ever edition of the Copa Tijas, and that they even though they finished near the bottom of the table, they were at least better than their 2 Texans team, that is Houston and Austin, in winning the Copa Tijas. And they also kind of had the Copa Tijas final with Austin FC, which they were able to win that and even lift the trophy in front of their fans. So at least they kind of won some silverware, even though I mean, I know some people will say, well, that's just kind of rivalry silverware. I don't think they care, like, especially with how bad this season for FC Dallas. They'll take any silverware, whether it's fan made or it's like the Supporter Shield or an MLS Cup that they could have potentially win this year. And then the last thing that went right for them is that, well, at least they were in the playoff race for a while. I mean, again, this team got off to a slow start to the season, but they kind of eventually did themselves out with a relatively good run in the middle of the season, especially during June. But then they kind of just become very inconsistent, and it just kind of fell off right at the end, and did not have the energy left to trying to make a playoff push. So what went wrong for this team? As I mentioned, the slow start of the season kind of crippled you. I mean, anytime when you get off to the start of the season, and how, for the first 2 months of the season, this team was sitting dead last in the Western Conference. Like, you are not going to get, unless you make a Seattle Sounders type kind of resurgent in the second half of the season, most of the time you're not going to make the playoffs if you're bottom of the table for that long into the beginning of the season. So yeah, I think that slow start really killed the momentum, because if they didn't get off to a slow start, or even if they were inconsistent to start the season, and maybe like right around the bubble of making the playoffs and in the playoff line, this team would have made it to the playoffs the amount of points that they picked up after they got on that good run in June and heading to the rest of the way. The second thing that went wrong in this team is, again, the defense was absolutely woeful for this team. When you give up 56 goals, which, it might not be that bad in modern day MLS, with the way that I've seen teams that have give up like 60 plus goals and some team even give up 70 plus goals. And in fact, it's kind of surprising the fact that this season, in the Western Conference, nobody have give up more than the amount of goals that FC Dallas has had. I mean, in previous year, this, I would say, is kind of like right around the range where it's pretty bad, but it's definitely not the worst that I've seen before. But this season, it seems like the Western Conference, at least for most of the team, there tends to be a little bit more locked down in terms of the defensive mark, and there also is a lot of team that is around like the 50 goal mark that they concede. So in some way, the defense wasn't as woeful as I would have wrote that, but I only wrote that because of the fact that they still finished with the worst defensive record in the Western Conference, and there were times where this team definitely looked like their defense was absolutely woeful, and just there's times where they just give up like goals for fun, and then there's also times where their defense does look good. I mean, I think the other thing that I will also say, the fact that the reason why FC Dallas probably they could have maybe gave up more than the 56 goals that they gave up this season, is Jimmy Maurer. I mean, Jimmy Maurer, when he was in goal, he was definitely locked down for this FC Dallas team and was kind of bailing out that bad defense. But then we also saw how Jimmy Maurer wasn't completely healthy for the entire part of the season, and the backup goalkeeper Felipe, yeah, he definitely shown his vulnerability, and when he was in net, I think that also kind of puts in terms of the number of goals that they gave up. That kind of shows that. But that being said, no, as I said, when you give up the most goals that anybody has in the Western Conference, it's rightfully so that the defense was one of the big problem. But also, maybe the goalkeeper could also be the problem, at least the backup goalkeeper, that is. And then, of course, the last thing went wrong for this team is, again, most of the signing that they made in the last offseason was a huge flop. I mean, I talked about this before with this Dallas team. As good as they have in terms of the academy, and that they pump in some really good young talented player that can definitely go to the starting 11 and still perform at the highest level. You also need to have some veteran present that can also perform around the same level. And unfortunately for FC Dallas, for the past couple of seasons, they have made some signings that it hasn't really make a lot of sense, and those players that they sign usually never develop to be a decent player, and it seems like eventually it has kind of caught up to them this year, where, despite the fact that they still have some really good player coming out of the academy, they just did not have the talent enough in terms of the veteran presence, and unsurprisingly, that's where it was kind of lacking for them to not make the playoffs once again. So moving forward, heading into next season, there's no doubt that that's going to be a huge focus, because with the money that they're going to get from Ricardo Pepi this offseason, and I know that deal is not officially done, but I'll be shocked if Ricardo Pepi turns next season. I mean, again, he's already said that he wants to leave it as soon as possible and want to make that move to Europe soon, and I'm assuming this offseason we are eventually going to get an offer from a European team to basically acquire Ricardo Pepi, and in exchange, FC Dallas, again, for the very first time, is actually going to get a huge sum of money. Like, for a while now, Dallas has been one of those teams that's been kind of criticized, and especially from their fans, the fact that they are a team that is just not only a selling team, but also a selling team that doesn't really make a lot of profit. And there's also cases where they sell off some of their academy player for basically nothing, and they turns out to be incredible when they go to Europe. And let's also not to mention the fact that when you look at the U.S. men's national team right now, pretty much half of the players in the U.S. men's national team, at least in the starting 11, comes from Dallas Academy. Like, that just shows you how good this academy is. But unfortunately, the reason why Dallas hasn't been kind of one of those teams that's been filled with riches because of their good academy is because they just haven't really sold off those players for a huge amount of money. But that being said, they're finally going to do so with this transfer of Ricardo Pepi, and we'll see whether or not if they're going to be smart with that money. I mean, we've seen teams before when they do get a a good player and eventually sell them off to Europe and get a huge sum of money, they don't usually spend that money wisely. So it's going to be interesting to see whether or not if FC Dallas is going to be one of those teams, or maybe they'll try to improve their scouting department, because I think that's another thing that they'll probably have to improve, consider of how there's just so many players that they sign, at least in these last couple of years, that when they come to MLS, they turns out to be a huge flop. And then the next thing that moving forward for this team is who's going to be the next sensation coming out of the Dallas Academy. I mean, this is kind of almost something I always said about FC Dallas every season in my moving for episode when I did them, is that, you know, who's the next Ricardo Pepi, and who's the next sensation that we will know by the end of next season that comes out from this Dallas Academy pipeline. And in some ways, it doesn't necessarily have to come out of the Dallas Academy. It could be maybe players that is starting for this team right now. And, you know, if there's one player that I think could really break out next season and could potentially be that the next Ricardo Pepi, is Jesus Ferreira. I mean, Jesus Ferreira this season, he of course scored 8 goals and bagged himself 9 assists. And quietly, he actually had a very decent season after a relatively disappointing year that he had in the 2020 season. And knowing the fact that, you know, with Pepe leaving this off season, and I'm assuming Jesus Ferreira is going to take his spot, he has a chance to show that he is going to be that goal scorer that is going to help this Dallas team, and a guy that, you know, there's already interest overseas that potentially he could be another Dallas player that could be moving on to Europe. So I think he could definitely be a player that will break out next season. And again, this year it's also been, I mean, a lot of people have talked about Ricardo Pepi and how incredible this season he has. Not a lot of people have talked about how Jesus Ferreira is also having a very good season too. And then the last thing moving forward for this team, so obviously this year FC Dallas will have a new head coach after Luchi Gonzalez was fired last season, and they of course replace him with Nico Estevez, who he does have some MLS experience as an assistant with the Columbus Crew, and that he also have experience in the U.S. men's national team as an assistant, and also even going back to his native country, Spain. He was part of Valencia for a long time as a youth head coach, and even was at one time an interim head coach for Valencia. So he's not completely foreign in terms of the coaching kind of role. Though what is foreign is the fact that this is going to be the first time he's actually taking charge of a team that is in the top tier and head coach them, and it's going to be interesting to see how he's going to do. I mean, I understand why FC Dallas decided to sign him. I mean, he's a young head coach that has history of working with good teams in MLS and also with the national team, and also have experience in terms of working with some youth academy team and being the head coach of those, and knowing the fact that FC Dallas always tends to like to put out players from their academy and love to play a young team. It's not a big surprise that they decide to hire a guy that has that experience of working at a very good youth academy. So yeah, we'll see how he's going to do, whether or not if he, of course, would work out for this team. But let me know in the comments below, what do you think of this video? And if you're an FC Dallas fan, what do you think went right, went wrong? And most importantly, moving forward, what do you think next season is going to be? Are they going to have a bounce back season and get themselves back into the playoffs? Because, you know, this is the first time the FC Dallas has missed the playoffs since 2017. And before that, they didn't miss the playoffs until 2013. This is not a team that regularly missed the playoffs, and you know, it's kind of weird that this year is kind of the case, and it really was the case because of the fact that they just kind of got off to a slow start that they never recover from. But let me know in the comments below what you think of this video, and yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you do, make sure you guys do a like, smash the subscribe button, and yeah, I of course will see you guys next time.